Hey everybody, KMO here, and we are live from the Fact TV studios. That's Falls Area Community Television. And I have a guest on Zoom from, are you actually in Texas?
I am.
Okay, we've got Professor Nick Kiersey. He's
Hello.
in deep Texas,
Deep, deep Texas. So deep it's practically Mexico.
practically Mexico. You hear a lot of Spanish, do you?
Oh, yeah. Loads of Spanish.
Speak any?
Un poco.
More
Learning
than
more.
me. Yeah? I've been dreaming of moving south of the border. Watching a lot of videos
Nice.
about living in Mexico or living in Colombia. There's a podcast I listen to. What's it called? The Expat Files.
Okay.
And he's in Guatemala. He has nothing good to say about Mexico.
Okay.
But anyway, occasionally I will watch learn Spanish videos on YouTube. I I tried the learn Spanish in your sleep videos. You ever seen
Right.
those? Very
I've
annoying thing
heard of
happened.
that kind of thing.
I was in a very stressful situation. I needed to hide from some villain or monster. And there was some annoying young woman who just kept insisting on speaking conversational Spanish out loud while I'm trying to hide from this monster. So that didn't work out. I never did that again. But Nick, you are the host of a podcast. It is, tell me about the podcast.
So it started a while back, a few years ago. It may not be the most appropriately named podcast for what I'm trying to do, but sometimes, names stick around, right? So I've been running a blog for many years called Occupy IR Theory. You can find it at occupyirtheory.info. And there, as part of what was initially sort of back in the 2013, 2014 period, what was initially kind of an effort to see what hypothetically a mic check, to use the old Occupy slang, what a mic check from the streets might say to international relations theory as an academic discipline. So we did a couple of, me and some friends did some writing in around that time, which got published in sort of open source journals, which were kind of a new thing in IR back then. So we wrote a little bit under this kind of hashtag of Occupy IR Theory, and the blog was set up around that, and it ended up being me that was the one who was kind of maintaining it and sort of paying for this blog. And I was, years later, it was kind of like, well, why am I keeping this up? It was it was an archive of a certain time, but it was sitting there it wasn't really being updated, it wasn't really being used. So I had some interest in doing a podcast, and admittedly, my interests have sort of shifted since then a little bit, more interested in kind of questions of futurism and acceleration and things like that, neither necessarily for or against, but definitely interested in talking more about it. And so that seemed to be the logical home for this new project, that to use the blog as a kind of because it existed and because it already sort of had a following, and it was already connected with my name. I decided to host my new podcast there, which is not new anymore. It's about 4 years old now. It's called Fully Automated. And it is a podcast sort of at the intersection of technology studies and international relations, and definitely sort of a podcast that has what you'd call a more Marxist orientation, though not exclusively. We do all kinds of interviews to do with space exploration, debates within the left about liberation and emancipation. Also very interested in sort of what you might call the post-identity left. That is a left that's kind of seeking to kind of maybe get out from underneath the thumb of the post-68 movement and try to get back to some kind of materialism or materialist orientation.
All right. I must warn you, you're mostly going to be speaking to an audience who they use the word imaginary as an adjective, for example.
Okay.
So sometimes I might ask you to unpack some of the lingo.
That's fine. That's fine. I'm totally happy to do that. I'll do my best at least.
Now,
Yeah.
you also like science fiction.
I do love science fiction, yes, and that's I think kind of how we've become connected lately because I'm working with some friends on a new venture at the minute. It's on Clubhouse, which is kind of new for me.
And me.
But this is an effort to kind of explore the politics of science fiction and the science fiction of politics.
So that is an event that takes place at a fixed day and time on
Yep.
Clubhouse. Go ahead and plug that.
12:30 Central Time every Wednesday. I'll share the link for that to KMO if you want to pop that in your description as well.
I absolutely will. Most of the people who hear this will hear it as an audio podcast, but
Right.
I'll leave it up on YouTube. Most people don't know to go to YouTube to look for my stuff, but this is a convenient way to convene.
Okay, very good.
So that's tomorrow. Unfortunately, it starts in the middle of a weekly call that I have to attend, so
Okay.
I'll be coming in late. But I went last week, and last week my weekly call was canceled, so I could attend the whole thing, and I had a great time. We talked about an episode
great.
of Star Trek Deep Space Nine,
Yeah, that's right.
which to me is a fairly recent episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, but now that I think about it objectively, there is no such thing as a recent episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. It was from 1995.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
it was an episode, it was a time travel episode, and Benjamin Sisko ends up taking the place of some historical figure who was a key player in you might call it a riot. They called it, I think, the Bell Riots is the official name. But
That's right.
he ends up basically bringing everyday but sort of marginalized people in front of the camera to put them on, what science fiction writers of 1995 thought the future internet would be. The story takes
Yeah.
place in the 2030s. And I suggested anyway, and I think a few people agreed with me, that it was absurdly sort of rose-tinted in its view of, what global connectivity would do for our, how we
Yeah.
relate to one another.
Yeah, it was a very symptomatic episode. I would agree with you on that. I mean, another aspect that really kind of jumped out for me, which I admit I wasn't really ready for, and maybe it just was interesting. I hadn't watched a Deep Space Nine episode in quite a long time, but I'd watched them all once upon a time. But revisiting that episode was also very kind of clear how nostalgic it was for the post-industrial lumpen proletariat. The expectation or the anticipation in the show was that you need these kinds of horizontally organized post-industrial movements. And when I say post-industrial, of course, I just mean like post-industrial era, where automation and various other economic pressures might have dislocated a lot of what we took for granted in the post-war era as the American proletariat and the struggle of the working class in America, which of course, through various political machinations, managed to strike quite a good deal for itself in the decades after World War II, right up until the era of the birth of so-called neoliberalism, where of course things have taken a turn for the worst. But one thing that was sort of struck me was how, in the present context where we are all sort of very much being led to sort of have new curiosity or renewed curiosity in the writings of the Black Panthers, Fred Hampton and people like this, who expected that racial minorities, especially African Americans, would be this kind of like vanguard of this new post-industrial movement, right? Where white people were kind of coming late to the lumpen proletarian game. The black leadership class would already have sort of established a vanguard, a revolutionary vanguard in the urban landscape, and it was so striking to me watching that episode that almost like cookie cutter, like you couldn't have scripted it better. The expectation that everything we want, which is what the Star Trek future, right? Fully automated luxury communism. It can happen, but it has to happen only. It can only happen. The sort of essential condition of its possibility in our timeline has to be these sorts of street protests, these street revolts. from this particular class. I found it really remarkable as a kind of presage of where we are today with our debates, that this Star Trek episode is already doing this,
In 95.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you've made multiple references to the lumpen proletariat. I thought the lumpen proles were the ones who were just too thick in the head to be of use to the revolution.
Well, I mean, the lumpen proletariat was taken up by the Black Panthers as a sort of, in a positive sense, right? That they were in a sense going to be the hope for the Marxist future. In the aftermath of the deindustrialization period. Of course, it's not sort of strictly in keeping with Marx's description of the lumpen proletariat, because Marx was kind of down on them, he said many negative things about the lumpen proletariat and sort of thought of them as like doltish, mercenary types who had no particular commitment to leftist causes, had no sort of essential interests that connect them or bound them to the left. They were guns for hire, but the post 68 left, I think, has a different take on this. Now, I will say that my reading of this is very much shaped by Clyde Barrow's recent book on the so-called dangerous class. That's the name of the book. But it is interesting that for Barrow, well, I don't know if you want to get into this right now, but for Barrow, the idea is that that's a mistake, right? That the Black Panthers kind of essentially took a wrong turn and put way too much hope in the possibility of a lumpen revolution, and Barrow kind of sutures that narrative to his own critique of the Trump era and the kind of rise of. I don't think I'm quite putting words in his mouth, but I mean, but if I am, I apologize here live on air. But it seems to me he's kind of connecting, kind of trying to go back to the older Marxist definition of the lumpen proletariat and sort of connect that to the deplorables debate, and sort of suggest that the January 6th insurgency that happened earlier on this year in Washington, D.C. was kind of an expression of an actual lumpen revolt, and it wasn't pretty. So, it just kind of, I think, shows up at least that Marxist idea that maybe the lumpen aren't as predictably reliable for your revolutionary purposes as you might wish, and they are certainly kind of guns for hire in that sense. But I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting debate. I have a lot to say about it, and we can talk more about it if you want.
Well, on the topic of being fully automated and having a wonderful
Yes.
post-scarcity society, you say that Star Trek is such a society. It's I would call it a post-scarcity society. You suggest that it is the embodiment of fully automated luxury communism. But with Star Trek, it's always, I mean, it has such a long history, a long production history. And it seems that the Star Trek of each era is very much of its era. And there are some things which have changed dramatically in society now, where if you look at the original Star Trek show, it just seems absurd that people would be so sort of culturally retrograde or, very hyper-conservative about certain things. And yet it's the far future. But I think a better embodiment, at least of my understanding of fully automated luxury communism, would be the culture from the E&M Banks novels. You're nodding as if you've read those novels, so let me pass it over to you and first encourage you to describe the culture.
I think I'm the wrong person to get into E&M Banks. I've casually read two of the novels, and I don't have a sort of a grasp on the hard dynamics of those books, unfortunately. I mean, get me on Kim Stanley Robinson any day of the week, and I can probably talk a bit about that. But unfortunately, Ian Banks is not my bailiwick. But I think just to sort of, I'm not sure if you're kind of coming at a kind of a critique of the idea of Star Trek as a fully automated luxury communism, but I think the beautiful thing about Star Trek is that it kind of leaves closed the question of the politics of fully automated luxury communism. And this is a big criticism that I have in the literature, or of the literature, which is that I think the critics of fully automated luxury communism kind of seize upon it as starry-eyed naivete, that it's putting too much hope and praise in the idea of a technological revolution being the cure to everything that ails us. And, people like Aaron Bananev, who has a book out right now, just out a few months ago, he is very critical of left-wing arguments about fully automated luxury communism from that perspective, and argues kind of from a more traditional leftist perspective that we need to kind of forget the technology and get back to the working class struggle. But now, to what extent Benenav's characterization is fair or not, I don't know, because certainly Star Trek doesn't necessarily help it, because Star Trek doesn't get into the politics of how we get there, if you know what I mean, what is to be done. But I think the fully automated luxury communism literature, another Aaron Bastani, the British commentator who, to my knowledge, coined the phrase fully automated luxury communism. He's very clear on this, and it's a point that's completely overlooked in, I think, the criticisms of his work, which is that he's not really kind of just describing the techno future that might come, the idea of a kind of a Marxist revolution of abundance that might just sort of be bestowed upon us kind of by accidentally or by the way as a result of the machines developing sort of superior ability to manage and produce themselves. I think what's clear is that FALC, as we call it in shorthand, fully automated luxury communism, FALC is a political project. And I really insist on this point. I think it's essential if you want to understand why people find it such a compelling concept. Because I think the left right now has such a hard time unifying behind anything, right? And I think that's why you see so much of the behavior that you see, which the problematic behavior you can see among many leftists online, various sort of debates about cancel culture and things like this, which are, there's an important critique to be made there. But, like, Adam Curtis and people like that, his documentary Hypernormalization was very informative a few years ago for many of us. This kind of turn, this cultural turn of the left I'm not so dismissive of it, but I think when it becomes the sort of singular focus and the trump card of the left, it can really send us in a wrong direction. And I think, it's a symptom of the powerlessness of the left at the moment. So what I think we actually do need to be doing is getting back to slogans, getting back to political organizing. And I think arguments like fully automated luxury communism provide many of these slogans and provide coordinates, provide goals that we can kind of shoot for as a way of moving towards, a more socialist trajectory. And I appreciate, your audience may not be fully down with me on that, but I mean, that's the argument. It's a kind of, what I'm hoping for is that it's potentially a language, a toolbox, if you will, that allows us to escape from the trap that we're in on the left right now, where we seem to be doing the opposite of what Dale Carnegie famously kind of wanted for us all, which, is to make friends and influence people. I think we can be more friendly and more influential if we have high quality slogans that show how the struggle combined with the technology can pay off. So
when I think about Star Trek and I think about the culture, and let me quickly describe the culture.
Yeah, you talk about the culture, because you made some great points about it in our clubhouse last week, and I'm sure the listeners would love to hear it.
So Ian M. Banks, he wrote what I would call a space opera series of books. It's basically, heroic characters having adventures in improbable circumstances, sort of, there's not a consistent cast. It's, the novels can be read out of order. There's only a couple recurring characters, but the culture itself is this enormous, probably thousands or millions of planets, but not everybody's living on planets. It's a human civilization, but it's basically run by AI. Everybody has everything they need. Everything is provided for them. There are no laws. There are no rules. Everything is sort of consensus driven, but it works. And there are no borders to the culture either. It sort of fades out as you get further from the center. But if you live on a planet or if you live on what's called a Banks orbital, which I think players of the game Halo would be familiar with, it's these big, like a ring world, but it doesn't circle a star. It's sort of out in orbit of a star, and it's tilted in such a way that there's a 24-hour day. I don't think they have the Star Trek replicator technology, but they're almost to that level. Nobody has to do anything they don't want to do. There's no toil. And like Star Trek on Earth is pretty boring. Very few Star Trek stories are set on Earth because Earth is so tranquil, so peaceful, so harmonious. Nobody's mad at anybody. Nobody is struggling for anything because everybody has everything they want. So to get any interesting stories, you have to jump in a starship and fly off to the far reaches of the Federation and deal with primitive people, with warrior culture Klingons or greedy capitalist Ferengi, or, you have to get out away from Earth to have a fun story. So with the culture... in the culture, I mean, if you want a job, you can have a job. You don't have to, but you can. And some of the most coveted jobs are in the culture's version of like the CIA, which is called special circumstances. There's a general group of people called contact, people being humans and AI, and contact is dealing with, forces and entities outside the culture, and then, the covert operatives, the ones who are going to go out on missions and actually do stuff that's fun. They're special circumstances, and almost every book involves somebody in special circumstances. And so the two fictional worlds are similar in that it's really super boring, to live there. And to get an interesting story out of it, you have to show some interaction between the culture and somebody who is warlike or acquisitive or domineering or something. I think the big difference is Star Trek makes a big deal out of, we don't let AI do our thinking for us. It's all humans or humans with funny, wrinkly foreheads making all the big decisions. Whereas in the culture, it's the exact opposite. Humans are great. Humans are fun. We love our humans to death. Put them in charge of civilization, as if, Yeah. And there's just that really unabashed embrace of, yes, AI will do it better than we do. So let me stop on the topic of AI and have you jump in there.
Well, that's a good one. I have read, I believe, the novel Uses of Weapons.
I love that one.
Which I thought was a cracker, and I do intend to revisit Banks soon. So the AI question is very interesting because, of course, so many of us, when we first sort of embrace the concept or find ourselves curious about it, automatically kind of jump to the science fiction world for our cues, right? And so what we find are that we preoccupy ourselves with debates about, the ethics of how we deal with AI. I think about the TV show Battlestar Galactica here, for example, which even raises kind of the question of like, can you rape a robot, a thinking, feeling robot? And these are all sort of fascinating symptoms, I think, of our own culture, if you'll forgive the phrase, because I think they're so disconnected from what AI actually is and will remain for the next several hundred years. I don't really foresee a thinking, feeling artificial intelligence in the offing. I think if that were ever to happen, it'll be a long way away. Simply because I don't think we have any kind of a clue about what our own intelligence is, or as human beings, we're not to sort of be nostalgic for humanity or something like that, but I think part of what it means to be human is to be nonlinear, right? I mean, to accept that human beings are kind of random. We don't really fall very neatly into categories. We tend to be slippy, messy creatures. and that's where creativity comes from, right? That's where the thing that makes us comes from, and we should celebrate that and appreciate that. I think, as frustrating as it can be sometimes, I mean, it is what makes us. So, the real question about AI is therefore, what is AI today, and what is AI doing with us today, and how do the science fiction representations of AI kind of disarm us against from seeing the key debates that we should be having today, which is like, what does it mean to live in a society that's so algorithmic, right? What does it mean to live in a society that is kind of essentially forcing us into sort of a multitude of processes that remove the randomness from our lives and from who and what we are. Now, of course, I'm not kind of a fetishist of randomness. I don't, that's not good for us politically to have too much of that. There's a trade-off there. Whether you're on the left or you're on the right, you need to be organized, right? You need to have structure. But what I will say is that, I think in our lives, AI is certainly something that has downsides, and as much as it can solve, as much as, say, cybernetics and debates about cybernetics are super interesting because they can solve problems to do with how we allocate goods and services, problems to do with how we allocate wealth. I think equally we all know that AI can kind of give us a false sense of the world that we're living in. I'm trying to think
That's
of the
its
name
main
of the
job,
scholar.
I think.
Cass, what's his name? It's not Leon Cass. I think it is actually Leon Cass. Several years ago was talking about, the idea of a daily me, and, Leon Cass Sunstein, I meant to say. He, I'm not a huge fan of him. I find him to be quite a conservative thinker, formerly attached to the Obama White House, I think. But he argued, I thought, very well, that one of the risks of AI sort of commanding our life world is that it sort of it diminishes the possibility of us encountering difference, right? And having alternative thoughts as a result of that. It's something to watch out for.
So, when thinking about fully automated luxury communism as a desirable state, for the world to be in, let me ask you to describe it specifically with these questions in mind. What technology is required to bring it about? Could we do it with existing technology, particularly energy technology or energy availability? What's the power source? And you've already mentioned that you think that AI, like artificial general intelligence, is hundreds of years in the future. So I take it for granted then that you think that fully automated luxury communism doesn't rely on artificial intelligence. But correct that as you need to. So go ahead.
I mean, I won't claim to have thought all of this through, KMO, but I'm very taken with books like The People's Republic of Walmart by Mikhail Rozworski and Lee Phillips. I think it's a great book. Everyone should read it. The idea there being that, look, we already have the technologies to handle the logistics of complicated social relations in a manner that allocates goods and services efficiently, using non-market-based solutions, which is obviously always the canard, right? Well, how are you? The market's the most efficient mechanism we've ever discovered for allocating resources. How are you going to sort of artificially get around that? And Rozarski and Phillips argue that we actually have already in our present time solved this problem. Large corporations like Walmart do this every day, by very, very complicated algorithms. And what they are arguing, and I think it's brilliant, is that, there's no reason why these algorithms can't be run by the public for the public. in a more democratically accountable manner. So, is that fully automated luxury communism? I don't know. Again, as I said earlier on, fully automated luxury communism isn't sort of a destination. It's a slogan. It's a political project. It's about the road from here to there. And if we think about it in those terms, I think it's quite interesting to look at debates about, the Chilean experiments on using cybernetics to organize the economy. It's quite interesting to look at books like Rosarski and Phillips's book on Walmart to see, again, just thoughtful, creative ideas about ways in which we can democratically manage the economy without necessarily regressing into these, what I would consider more unattractive, horizontalist left sort of propositions, which always sort of succumb to these accusations, like Oscar Wilde sort of famously put it. The problem with socialism is it takes up too many evenings. Of course, that's because you're always in a meeting somewhere, trying to figure out, trying to vote about some obscure point about what to do with the sewage system in your local town or something like this.
Before you go on, let me interrupt for a second.
People find that off-putting. People find that that kind of level of being sort of asked to democratically deliberate and participate in every single thing to do with your economy to be, kind of almost childish. We have technologies at our disposal, so we don't have to worry about these things. We have the means at our disposal to, democratically decide some basic parameters for how these things should function, and then just let them go. Let them rip. They don't need to be looked at every week. They certainly don't need, mass civilian assemblies to come and discuss them every week, right? So I think in that respect, the hope, the promise of using cybernetics and using automation for communism, if you will, is that it allows us to kind of get on with the business of being free and not have to get super bogged down in these details, which is rightly or wrongly what many of us feel anarchists are asking us to do, right? So we're kind of coming at this from a anti-anarchist perspective. Obviously not blanket anarchist, anti-anarchist. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in anarchism, but that's the stereotype that's invoked about anarchism is kind of what we're trying to assuage here, right? That people get so and not without cause worried that what they're being asked to do by the left today is deliberate on everything, every minute of every day. And what we're trying to sort of show is no, actually, you do get to go ahead and have a life and be free if we're willing to let cybernetics help us along the way. And of course, the state, right? The state has a role to play here. Sorry, I feel like I might maybe alienating your audience a little bit because I'm getting kind of in the weeds, and I apologize for that. I hope this is useful for you.
Well, let me throw that same question back to you, for review. What about energy? Does fully automated luxury communism run on coal, or does it run on solar and wind energy, or what's powering this?
I don't think we have a black and white answer to that question. I personally come from the school of thought that says we will have to rely on nuclear power for a lot of our energy in the future, because I don't think that, again, I'm totally ripping off Lee Phillips on this. So, if you want a better version of the narrative I'm about to give you, just go to him. He writes in Jacobin, and he can be found, getting hauled over hot coals on Twitter for this position by a lot of people on the left. So, the left isn't fond of what I'm about to say here, but the reality is I don't think we will get the kind of energy that we need for everything from renewable sources. There are problems, at least in the present moment. Maybe in the next 100, 200 years, we can get better solar energy, better wind-powered energy, better batteries to store that energy. But in the meantime, we do have to sort of consider that a lot of our industrial applications need consistent, deliverable energy levels that are high, and right now, in terms of green energy, nuclear seems to be the only way to do that. And I think I would insist that nuclear is a relatively clean technology. I think, you just look at what Germany has done, getting out of nuclear altogether since the Fukushima nuclear power disaster. And it's not pretty, they've switched back to coal. They don't have enough renewable energy to serve their needs. So they're bringing coal power plants back online. And I think we're probably going to need to avoid that in the future. So that's the energy question. I mean, I think another useful aspect of this, though, is that it's not just, where do you get the energy, right? Like the technology itself will make the delivery of energy safer. You'll conserve more energy out of the system by having a better grid. There are possibility of more local sources of energy going to be available, so we may not be as dependent as we would imagine on a grid. Battery-powered cars, I think, will be more energy efficient than, combustion engine-based cars. There's a lot of proof or evidence to suggest that that's the case at this stage. So it'll be a mixed bag. But again, as I say, the goal here isn't to have the perfect solution described. We want to get away from sort of the territory where we're getting called utopians. The goal is to draw people's attention to the fact that we could be doing so much more with what we have, and that it can make people's lives better in the here and now.
So it's fully automated, luxury communism. Speak to the luxury part.
I'm glad you asked me that, actually. That's a part that I think often gets under-examined. I might be a little bit off base compared to other people who advocate folk here, but I think a really good scholar on this is James Livingston, who wrote a really good book about 10 years ago called Against Thrift. And in that book, he just really goes to town on the post-68 left. And when I say post-68 left, I hope people are kind of following along with what I mean here. This is the kind of the anti-consumerist identity politics style left that sort of picked up after, it became apparent what the USSR was doing and the atrocities that were being kind of carried out in the name of communism in Central Europe and Eastern Europe and in Asia. So what you have in Livingston's argument is a recognition, I think, that consumerism itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, that in the future utopia, there will have to be consumerism, if it's going to be attractive to people. I think that's the main strategic point, right? If you want to sell it, it's going to have flat screen televisions. Whereas a lot of the left in the 70s and 80s spilt a lot of ink on the argument that, capitalism was reproducing itself off of kind of a false consciousness created by crafty and clever advertisers who wanted nothing more than to keep people addicted to Coca-Cola and Levi's and Snoopy, clothes with Snoopy logos and things like that on them, which of course were big in the 70s, right? So sorry, I was just remembering some articles I read a long time ago about that. So the idea here is that, representation is key, that we're living in an era where our politics is fundamentally mediated by how we represent ourselves to ourselves, as opposed to any kind of question about, what do people want? What does it mean to live in a utopian society? Are we going to, just kind of cast off all these worldly possessions and go and meditate in a cave like mystics? Are we going to become ascetic beings and renounce worldly pleasures? Is the body, is the flesh nothing, right? So in its haste to be anti-consumerist, the left, I think, forgot to explore the question of luxury and how and whether and to what extent there should be limits to that. And it strikes me, having read Livingston's book, he makes a really good argument there that the ultimate limit to consumerism shouldn't really be, oh my God, false consciousness, too many people like the new Britney Spears album when it's clearly no good. I mean, that sends you down the road of the Frankfurt School and, sort of arrogantly posturing high culture as a kind of a better alternative to low culture, this kind of thing, right? So what you want instead, I think, is a limit that recognizes the environment, of course, right? Like, that's just a very strategic, pragmatic limit to what we can consume. We cannot consume more than our planet will allow. But apart from that limit, what's the problem, right? Like, are PlayStations not cool? I mean, you can have a great time on them. Gaming is probably going to be part of our utopian future. I would like to think it would be. Probably designer handbags with fancy labels will be part of our utopian future. I mean, they won't be centered around the profit motive anymore, conceivably, but if I can venture the point, I would say that, looking good, feeling stylish, even modifying your body if you want. I mean, there's no intrinsic reason why these things cannot be part of the left in the future, or the left promise of what the future can be.
Got some comments here. Benner Rubber says, so is the agriculture industrial? Can it be regenerative agriculture, which does better at allowing the soil to have water absorption capacity, which affects the climate via hydrology? Thermodynamics of healthy soil is rad, says Benner Rubber. There's a substantial population of people who are nauseous at externalizing our relationship to the environment to an industrial behemoth that affords a culture to attain absurdities like veganism. There's a lot packed into that.
That's a lot. That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
How do you get from the behemoth to veganism? Sorry, was there more?
No, that's it. But I mean, if we want to jump to the end to veganism.
Go for it. Sorry, please. I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
If we want to jump to the end to veganism, I think, let me read his exact words again. There's a substantial population of people who are nauseous at externalizing our relationship to the environment to an industrial behemoth that affords a culture to maintain absurdities like veganism. And I think the point he's making with veganism is that vegans think that since they are not eating animal products, their diet is harmless, when in fact, if it's an industrial diet, which is supplied to them by, heavy, intensive uses of pesticides and fertilizers and enormous monocultures, fence row to fence row monocultures that, if you drive I-70 from one end of the country to the other, you just endless seas of corn and soybeans. That's it's not harmless. That's not the way these ecosystems are meant to operate. And so the reason we do that is because you can do that with a bare minimum of human labor. You are outsourcing most of that, that work to machines. So we have less than 2% of the population engaged in agriculture now. And for people like Ben Weber, I think that's not a good thing. So is fully automated luxury communism one that is fed by industrial agriculture and all the harms that come with it?
Yeah, I think it will have to be unapologetically industrial. And I think I would, gingerly push back on the idea that that the problem with industrial agriculture is that it's industrial. I think the problem with industrial agriculture is that it's capitalist, and and as a result, it's not accountable. It's not accountable to the externalities it creates. It's not accountable to how it handles the land. It's not accountable to the people who depend on it for their nutrition and for their calories. There's a lot to say here. I would start by broadly, let me see where I can go here. One of the most powerful moments to me in my sort of intellectual development in recent years was a little clip interviewing Slavoj Žižek in a trash heap or trash dump. And it was in the movie Examined Life. Who made read it. The name's on the tip of my tongue. It'll come to me in a minute. But yeah, it's in the documentary The Examined Life. And so we have Zizek, the Slovenian philosopher. Astra Taylor is the name of the person who made the documentary. So Zizek's walking around this trash dump, you know, talking about how, you know, the big problem facing us, those of us who want to do something about our ecological problems right now, is that, you know, the trash dump just encapsulates so much about how we disavow the externalities of our production system. But he warns in this video, and I think it's a very strong argument that I've seen now repeated multiple times in other sources, but this was the first time I really myself encountered this argument, because I think I had always been, up to that point in time, someone who was a certain kind of environmentalist. Let's just leave it at that. But Zizek warns us in this video, like, not to be fetishistic about nature itself as being an unproblematic realm, right? Despite the way movies like Avatar represent nature, you know, it has not and is not a beautifully harmonious whole wherein everything is perfectly fine, were it not for the interference of humanity as some kind of external parasite that invades nature or exploits nature or treats nature as a standing reserve. Instead, says Zizek, you know, no, there are lots of creatures that are farmers. In our natural world, we can see a lot of them at work, beavers, ants, and human beings are, of course, the same, right? So they are part of nature and they are farming creatures by definition. The question is, are we willing to step up and acknowledge that's what we are? What Zizek argues for is a farmer's mindset, a farmer's approach to being an ecological activist, if you will, or an ecologically sensitive citizen. And in this argument, he believes that, you know, a good farmer, or just like a good farmer understands he has to attend to the land if he expects and believes the land is going to give back to him, then so do we also have to tend to our garden, so to speak, right? We have to develop a farmer's mindset. And that will actually be the way we keep the ecology of the planet whole, not by treating nature as some kind of sanctified realm, pristine realm where everything would be fine were it not for humanity. He draws our attention, I think, very thoughtfully to the existence of oil itself and asks us the question, you know, like, where do we think oil comes from? It comes from a massive destructive event, most of it, you know, that wiped out in one blow 90% of the organic material on the planet, you know, the organic life, and deposited it into the soil. And that's where oil comes from, the oil that we put in our cars, right? So our civilization depends on this carnage and death for its existence. But that doesn't mean that we should, you know, back away from the responsibility of having to look after nature, but probably better not to call it nature, probably better to call it the ecology, and probably better to again, recognize the limits of the ecology in terms of what we can do with it as farmers, but to understand that, look, one way or another way, we are dealing with something that we have and that we cannot but look at as humans, right? Nature is a human narrative. Ecology is a human narrative. Nature itself doesn't really care, right? It doesn't have a consciousness. It doesn't think. It doesn't have a heart. It doesn't have a brain, right? So one way or another, it's an aesthetic creation of the human mind, and its politics are the same, right? Now, to move from that then to from having knocked nature down a peg or two, that's not to say we should just do whatever we want with it. Of course, we have to use our technologies to try to get more out of it with less impact on it. And you may have seen, I'm not sure how much hope we should take from this, but it seems auspicious that we now have the possibility of growing perfectly good beef in a test tube, right? Genetically, once upon a time, it was DNA from the thigh of a cow, and now it is being grown in a vat as a perfectly viable form of meat. In Singapore, there's a restaurant right now where you can get a beef burger, a hamburger made out of vat-grown beef for $50, right? And that same beef burger would have cost you $150,000 even 10 years ago or something like that. So the price of this kind of potentially very valuable form of meat production, if we're interested and concerned to deliver calories and protein, nutrients to people around the world at a price, if the cost of producing this fat-grown beef becomes lower than the cost of growing it from fields, then you know obviously what's going to happen. Those wild herds, those farmed herds of cattle will no longer be needed as much. You know, they're a huge source of methane, which creates global warming, and we have a huge opportunity to remove a lot of emissions from human activity, and a lot of the burden on the planet's atmosphere accordingly. So I would be optimistic about possibilities like that, through not just through applying science and technological development to our production systems, but you know, those kinds of decisions aren't going to be made by capitalism unless there's a buck to be made. And you know, these sorts of technologies will be seen as kind of entertaining baubles by capitalist elites, and their potential for being rolled out as a serious solution to global hunger and as a serious solution to climate change are not going to be realized.
Well, Nick, we are just about out of time, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to talk about the writing of Kim Stanley Robinson, because I absolutely love the fact that in a science fiction field, particularly on the screen, not so much on the page, but on the screen, science fiction is almost synonymous with a dark future, dystopianism, you know, cyberpunk or crime or totalitarianism. And Kim Stanley Robinson's novels have the ability to acknowledge all the problems that we face and still show us a potentially hopeful future. I mean, one of my favorite books by him, I think, is one of his lesser known ones. It's Pacific Edge.
I haven't read it.
Oh, it's a utopian California, but it's also
sounds great.
It's also a fiction within the novel itself. But okay. I know you've read Aurora.
Yes, I have. Yeah, I love that one.
Heard you mention it. Did you read Red Moon?
Yes.
So these are two novels that he's written like back to back, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And in both of them, a major plot point is the first artificial general intelligence wakes up. You know,
right.
As a result of having been painstakingly trained and shaped by some other character in the story. That's clearly on his mind right now. He's put it into those last two novels.
Yeah, but, I think he might be wrong about that, though.
Yeah.
the time frame, you know?
Yeah.
I think the time frame might be quite wrong on that. But I really liked the New York one. I think it's New York 2150 or something like that.
I have not read that
That's
one.
another recent book of his. And then I've only just started the new one, Ministry of the Future. I think those kind of books that he does about climate change are very, very interesting. And the way he navigates the political choices that sort of bring us into that we make to respond. You know, the complexities of the political choices that we're facing when climate change is basically inevitable. I think those are his most powerful kinds of works. The question of what it means to live after climate change, what humanity looks like after climate change, are great.
Well, Nick, I'm afraid we have to wrap it up here, but I know this won't be our last conversation because I'm going to show up to that Clubhouse event as often as I can. Again, that's Wednesdays at 12:30 Central, right?
Yes, and I also want to invite you onto my podcast, which has been on hiatus for a few months now, but we just wrapped up school here, and my grades are all in. Mm-hmm. So I have time now over the summer to get back to doing something that I really love doing, which is interviewing people and editing podcast interviews. I'm sure you love doing it yourself. So it'd be nice to have you on if you would. I'm publicly challenging you now to agree to come on my show. And there's people watching this who will have heard you.
Yes.
And you have to keep your promise now.
Well, you didn't need to bring out the big guns. I much prefer to be the guest on a podcast than the host. It's much easier. There's no editing.
Very good.
No
yeah,
uploading.
I think you're right about that, by the way.
All right. Professor Nick Kersey, thank you very much.
What a pleasure. Thanks, KMO.